Today I'm going to share with you how I personally spend about 5% of my income both paying taxes and on my cost of living, and how you can do so too. So if it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We're a boutique consulting firm that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally reduce their taxes, diversify and protect their assets, build their freedom with things like second passports. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. And we also host the biggest and best offshore event called Nomad Capitalist Live. And it is through the growth of that business. This is my how I support myself. I run a business and we help people do that. And so I'm going to tell you how I spend about 5% of my income that goes to pay both taxes through kind of proper tax optimization. We've talked about that in separate episodes where I talk about how I reduced my tax rate from 43% in the US to single digits offshore, but also how I reduce my cost of living. And so 5% roughly is the number. What that means is more money for giving, and a greater attitude and a greater willingness to do that, because you don't feel like, hey, I just gave away 43% of my money to people who are going to waste it. So there's definitely a mindset shift when you go overseas that I've always talked about, where you want to be more giving, you're open to being more giving, and you can do a lot more. Also, you can build more generational wealth. You can be focused a lot more on the future. And so for me, as kind of a security-minded person, I have never spent 100% of my money. I was raised to never do that, whether you want to call it pay yourself first, whether you want to call it living below your means. That was always kind of the very Protestant ethic that I was brought up with, and that just makes sense to me personally as someone who started a business during the global financial recession of the late 2000s, and just saw a lot of people going to get beaten up. Just always wanted to have safety and security, and so obviously this is easier to do if you're making 100 million or 10 million or even 1 million, I suppose, than it is at $100,000. But I can tell you, even when I made $100,000, I was always like saving as much money as possible. I was always reducing expenses. I would spend a lot of money on stuff that was important to me back in my early 20s on starting traveling and exploring this nomad capitalist stuff. But I really didn't spend that much money on anything else. I kept all the expenses really low. So I'm going to walk you through how I do this. The first question people ask is, well, what is income? And so income is salary. I believe, especially in kind of the offshore environment, you want to be an employee of your own business. And so when you remove the negative tax consequences of like, oh, I don't want to take a salary, I want to take dividends, or I want to take distributions, or I want to reinvest it in the company. When you remove those elements and you just run an organic business where you move money around in an organic fashion, you take a salary. So I do that from the business, take dividends from the business, and then any other payments from the business and from investments. So it could be dividends from stocks or real estate investments or anything like that. So that's the income that I'm counting. Another question people ask kind of on that level is, aren't you just expensing a bunch of stuff through your business? And again, if you are going where you're treated best with your business, if you are dramatically reducing the tax cost because you're going to countries that welcome your business, not repel it, you will start to make organic decisions about where you pay for things. So, for example, recently took a trip to a country, had planned to meet some pretty high up people, didn't end up working out. And so I think I paid for that trip myself personally, because it just turned into like a trip where it wasn't really of great business utility anymore. And so it really didn't matter to me, right? Because it's not like I'm trying to reduce corporate profits. I don't mind just paying it for myself. And so I think that there's the tendency of, let me just expense everything, kind of goes away when you know that there's really no great benefit to expensing things. And in fact, in some cases, if you're running an offshore company, depending on where that company is, expensing things actually makes your accounting more complicated, because you need to provide those invoices and stuff like that. So if you're coming from the US and then you move to operating your company in Hong Kong, you're going to have probably a greater paperwork burden to where you say, you know what? I'm paying so little tax, or I'm paying zero tax. It's just worth paying things. And again, you're running your life more organically. And so my perspective on living on a lot less than I make is, number one, I want to assess like how long I'm going to be at a given level. And so really, it hasn't been that many years that I've felt comfortable like, okay, I have some skills in this business thing. I've started numerous businesses over the years, sold a couple of them, gave one of them away to a friend, now running Nomad Capitalist, and the business here has grown, I guess, about 23 or 24-fold, something like that, since I expatriated, just as a point of reference, about 4.5 years ago. And so when every year numbers go up, really, for the last 15 years, you're like, okay, like where's the soft landing? Like, eventually, like, where do you stop growing the business? And so if you're a person who is security-minded like myself, you're like, okay, you're not going to necessarily grow 500% a year. Like, I don't want to be like settling into some particular level, given that, listen, some businesses, for example, during COVID had big peaks and are now coming back down. Look at the stocks in the stock market where it's like they're down 80%. Look at Peloton or something, right? Where I never want to settle in at some level until I know like I'm on really firm ground. And so by doing that, I'm always kind of living on where I was a year or 2 years or even 3 years ago. And so, anyone can make $1 million 1 year. We have seen people like that over the years, where they come in, they make $1 million, they run some blog, or they make $2 million for a year or two. And then it just kind of falls apart because it wasn't a sustainable system. I want to focus on building sustainable systems first and making sure that at each new level I get to, I have solid footing. And so what we're doing right now, at a time after 2 years of crazy politics and Joe Biden getting elected and COVID and all kinds of stuff that really caused a lot of growth, is slowing down a little bit and focusing on building out some of the systems and some of the growth systems that could have been in place, but there really was just no time because we were always kind of running to keep up with things in the last 2 years to make sure that we can sustain the level that we're at, and therefore I can, not have the 5% go to 20% and kind of feel uncomfortable. So my suggestion to anyone who's starting out in business, and especially who's growing a business relatively quickly, is realize that anyone can get to a level for a year. I'm not saying doubt yourself, but I think certainly one of the things that I resonated with, I was watching an interview with Jay Leno, a couple of different places. I think Joe Rogan and somewhere else, and he's like, I always got ahead. He said I always feel like I did well by having a certain relatively low level of self-confidence. Like I never thought like, hey, maybe this is the best it gets. There's just kind of a low level of self-esteem, perhaps, that has worked for me and that worked for Jay Leno, because I realized nothing is guaranteed forever, and I kind of want to assess where I'm at. So how do I do this? So basically, the big part is reducing your tax, and we've talked before, I'm a big believer in countries around the world want competition, and if you can go to their country and they're like, hey, pay effectively 1% tax. It may not be that's a 1% tax rate. It may be only a certain portion of your income is subject to a tax, or there's an exemption, or many different ways you can get there. But let's just say the net rate is 1%. And in my case, it may be across different jurisdictions. But let's just say your personal income tax burden is like 1%, and you have a business that makes $5 million a year. You may be paying 5, 10, 20, 100 times more than the average person in that country. If you're living my lifestyle, you're not always living there, and so you're kind of contributing a lot more to the country, and you wouldn't be there if they were taxing you the same 43% that you left in the first place. And so I think that dramatically reducing your tax burden, obviously, if I was living in the U.S., 43 cents at the peak of every dollar was just going at the door, and it's gone, right? Got 57 cents left to work with. You've got to buy food, you've got to buy groceries, you've got to pay the mortgage, you've got to do everything. And so go back, by the way. You have a mortgage. I had a mortgage, and my mortgage payment was pretty low because, again, I was pretty security conscious, and I happened to buy like the lowest point of the market in Phoenix, Arizona, kind of somewhat by happenstance. That house is worth like 4 times what I paid for it back then. But if you are paying 43 cents at the door because you're living in a high-tax country, you're probably more likely to say, yeah, you know what, I'll take the monthly payment. I like to avoid monthly payments. I have absolutely zero debt other than money that I float on a credit card for 30 days and then pay. And so, the first way to reduce expenses is reduce the tax, get that down to a very low rate. Some people pay literally zero. Some people want to pay 1, 2, 5, depending on where you want to live. You pay a little bit more, you get a lot more options to choose from, places in Europe, etc. But on top of that, it really is kind of shocking for me to think at this point, like you have barely half of every dollar you make to spend on every single thing that you need. And so when you do that, not only do you have less money to put into stuff like, let me just buy a property and just be done with it. I don't want to pay a monthly bill. I don't want the hassles. I don't want to have to set up auto pay and then it changes and then something. Let me just buy the place. Less money and worse psychology to do that. And so then you're just kind of adding to your monthly bills, which to me has kind of a negative effect. I don't want to pay monthly bills. I want to have almost no bills. If I can just pay for something up front, I'm going to do that. And so that's how I've reduced expenses that way. And so the other thing that I've seen is there was a shift for me when I was out of a system that I didn't like. I think the U.S. government wastes a lot of money. I think most Western governments waste money. And there's just a toxic culture that's only gotten worse since I left of like, you didn't build that, and why aren't you paying more? It's like, I'm paying close to half of what I'm making to be wasted when a lot of people are paying nothing, and then they get on my case about that. It doesn't really feel like great. And so when you get out of that system, there's a mindset shift that says, all right, now you can be more successful because you're in alignment. And so I think that was one thing that helped me. So where obviously, again, you make $10 million a year, you spend 5% of that, let's say 100 grand goes to taxes, 400 grand goes to cost of living. If you have no mortgage payment, if you have, if you're living in more affordable places potentially, even if you're not living in more affordable places, that 400 grand, that's like $1,100 a day. You can spend it pretty easily, but if you're someone like me who I'm traveling between countries, I don't want to spend $300,000 to, fly private between Kuala Lumpur and Bogota. I mean, it's just not worth it for me, even if I could do that. And so, obviously the higher you get your income, the easier it is to reduce the percentage. And I think that it's easier to increase the income when you pocket more of the tax savings, you reinvest that back in yourself, you reinvest that back in the business, you grow a lot faster, and therefore the percentage of the spending just automatically comes down. And so you can also focus on expansion. So one of the things that I've seen is, initially when I was living in the US, I knew the US, and then I started traveling more and I kind of gained some knowledge. But it's only by living outside of the US and living this nomad capitalist lifestyle that I've really seen and started to understand other cultures, which has allowed us to do business with those cultures or find other business opportunities, which then grows the bottom line in a way that someone who's purely focused on the US maybe would have missed. It certainly makes things more diversified to where if there's a time when the US becomes a softer market, you have other markets in different places, and so you certainly have more kind of income security. And I wouldn't have had that had just been sitting in the United States. So my advice to any entrepreneur who's growing is you want to reduce stupid costs while you grow. One of the things that I've talked about is being outside of the US. I am for the first time in about a decade buying a car just because I thought it was the right thing to do at a certain level, not because I even love cars that much. But I thought, okay, this is like an overdue step. But for the longest time, when you live in the U.S., like, why don't you have a car? What are you, some kind of loser? Even when I would take walks around my neighborhood at night, people would like, what's your problem? Like, where's your car? It's like, it's at home in the garage, right? But, for me not loving cars, I just said, I'm just going to have a collection of pied-à-terres in different city centers, and I'll just kind of walk places, and if I have to get a car service, I will, and that worked very well for me. And so I got out of a culture where I bought stuff I didn't need, and so that kind of reduced it. Not that if you're making $10 million, a car is that expensive, but certainly, the idea is you're making $10 million, you're like, I'm not going to buy a Honda Civic, and so the expense does kind of add up. Not to say that if you want a car, you should deprive yourself of that, but I think that if probably people who live in certain societies do too much kind of silly stuff. Was talking to someone not that long ago who was like, hey, if I move overseas, I got to send my kids to the American school because like everyone I know who lives overseas or who came back or whatever, like that's what they do. And it's like $100,000 a year for this guy to send his kids to international school. And I'm like, you could probably hire a tutor for like a lot less than that, or they could go to like this school, or, like, do you really need to do that? And there's come some kind of social pressure on him, like that's what he's got to do, and that eats up a big part of his income that I think is a problem. And so for me, living overseas, prioritizing decisions that are important to me, there are certain things I like to spend money on, right? And so if we just use the aforementioned example of it's $500,000 in spending and it's 100 grand of tax and it's 400 grand, I mean, I'm going to prioritize things like I want custom shirts or suits. It's kind of hard for me to wear off the rack anyway, so I have to do it kind of out of necessity. But like I want to spend money on shoes, or I'm going to spend money on, not so much anymore nice hotels, but I want to spend money on decorating and renovating places that I live so I have a great environment. That's more important to me than, I want to own a fancy car, or I want to go on yacht trips around the Mediterranean in the summer. Like I value working, which obviously reduces the amount of money that you're spending. When you are working, you're spending a lot less. But for me, the big takeaways are reducing your tax cost, increasing your motivation, increasing your focus on growth and reinvestment in your business, building the number back up to where, if you're in the United States or you're in some kind of Western country right now, you can probably reduce your percentage of money spent on sunk costs, both taxes and cost of living, from 70% down to like 30% just by moving overseas. And maybe even 20% depending on where overseas you live. And then once you take that, then you can just kind of tweak and adapt to get that 20% consistently down to where you're in single digits. Then you take the rest of that money and you just invest it in things. You go out and acquire businesses. You go out and again, I think giving is an important thing, but putting money back into everything that is working, it's just going to become exponential at some point. And I think that for the average person who is not using extreme leverage, who's not in Silicon Valley, just running a kind of a normal business, you can scale that business to $5, $10, $20 million a year. And by using this model, you're going to put a lot more money in your pocket to grow that generational wealth a lot faster.